Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the introduction and chapter one. And it really caused you to pause to think about how you define rigor and the symbolism that we used here, right? Or the metaphor that we use, I probably should use metaphor. The metaphor that we used here was the pendulum and the pinwheel. The pendulum really makes sense from a hierarchical standpoint, right? Because you have to privilege certain types of learning over others. And that's not really a realistic way of how humans learn. We don't learn in a hierarchy. We don't learn in a vacuum. We are not a computer, right? We actually learn in a much more fluid manner. And a pinwheel actually is a metaphor that we could use that actually illustrates this type of balance. And the idea that we learn things and relate things and apply things, and we do this in multiple ways, is really where rigor comes in. Rigor is the equal intensity and integration of knowing things, relating things, and applying things, or surface, deep, and transfer. And these reflective questions are really associated with, well, one, do you agree with that? And two, how similar or different is that idea from the way that you think about it, or the way that you convey that to students, or the way that you talk about that with parents, or the way that you talk about that with other faculty? When you think about how you learn, whether it's through a hobby, whether it's a new practice that you're trying to put into place, do you really think that you learn that as a hierarchy, or do you really learn that through this fluid manner of knowing things and relating things and applying things? And you could start at the application and then go back. I think of a lot of sports that I did when I was younger, that a lot of times it was more at the transfer level to start. Like I would swing and then I would say, okay, here's kind of what's going on. Here's what you need to do with your elbow and all of those things. And I think when we do that, I think that that's a pretty, when we have those conversations, I think that's a pretty interesting way of saying, yeah, learning is probably more centered this way. But those first couple of questions is, how do you currently define that? And is there a gap? And if there's a gap, I think that really helps you and your team say, okay, well, given that gap, what are some small doable things we can do to start to address that gap, and in a thoughtful way? I don't think it's about going and changing policy tomorrow. I don't think it's about saying you're wrong and I'm right. It's really saying, look, do we see that this probably isn't hierarchical, but that it's taxonomical? I mean, it wasn't called Bloom's hierarchy. It's called Bloom's taxonomy. And as you go through those reflective questions, it starts to talk about, do you see those categorical levels or types of learning? Do you see them reflected in your lessons? Do you see them reflected in your units? Do you see them oriented in different ways? So it's not all surface and then eventually we get to transfer. Or if you're in more of a problem or project-based approach, it's not all transfer, and then maybe you get some surface. We often see that we skip the deep. And there's a number of articles that I've put on the course that you can go and you can take a look at around the importance of deep learning. And sometimes we skip that because when we have a pendulum, we often see the extremes between surface and transfer. And so that part in the middle gets skipped. And that's the deep learning. That's where most of our outcomes or most of our standards sit, is they sit at the deep level of learning. And so what happens is sometimes that just gets skipped as we're traversing between surface and transfer. Then we start to move to this idea of those dispositional practices, and do we cultivate those with students, and do we value those in our classrooms, and do we see how we can bring that in small and doable ways? So there's those dispositional and competency-based habits, which really form those 10 key habits that we're going to be spending the majority of our time on. 4 of those are dispositional. And then the other 6 of those are around these competencies of surface, deep, and transfer, each taking 2 specific habits. So surface taking habits 5 and 6, deep taking 7 and 8, and then transfer taking 9 and 10. I think one thing that's really helpful after you have that discussion is to go through some of the next steps. Take a survey. Where do you think you sit around the implementation of these particular practices and your students? I've also put in another video, if you go to the part of the course that talks about the specific application, there is a habit mapping protocol that may be really interesting that you could do with a team. You have to get some stickers, you print out this little habit placemat that we have. And it's a really helpful way to get a sense of like themes and patterns and to have a discussion. Whether you use the survey or the habit mapping process, I think it's really, really helpful to have a protocol to really structure the dialogue so that we don't just jump to inferences. We don't just jump to next steps, but we really think thoughtfully about what that information is telling us, that evidence is telling us. And my recommendation is to use a what, so what, now what protocol. You'll notice in the book, there is an example of the what, so what, now what protocol. You can Google it. The National School Reform Faculty, the School Reform Initiative, Facing History, I believe, might have that particular protocol. I also show it in a couple of other videos within this program, but pick a protocol to structure this and then home in on one particular habit or two that you're really, really interested in. My suggestion is pick one, but pick one that you really think is critical for you. And then as we jump into chapter 2, we're really going to think about what is the habit science that we need to be thinking about as we approach potentially new practices or refined practices, not just for us, but for students, so that we can use habit science, because it's not just giving this practice or this habit a go, but it's actually sustaining it over time, right? It's not just saying, oh, we tried it. It's actually building this over and over and over, because the first couple of times we try something, it's not going to tell us whether or not that is actually something that is building and sustaining the types of habits we want to see in students. It's usually a slow burn. So there's a few ideas for you. Once you've quit hearing, once I stop yapping, I'd like you to stop this, go through those reflective questions, take some time going through those next steps, and don't skip the next chapter. Don't say, oh, let's just get to the what. I really want us to think about the how, because I think it's not just for you. I actually think there's some really great things in here to be thinking about. How do I help my students develop and sustain habits? As James Clear said, we never rise to our goals. We fall to our systems. You know, the difference between those who stay in a New Year's resolution on February 1 is not the goal they set. It's the systems they have in place to make sure they're going and they're working on that each and every day. That's the next chapter. All right. Thanks, everybody.